Welcome everyone tonight. I'm Professor von Robert, Charlotte von Robert, the director of the Taube Center for Jewish Studies. And I'm happy to welcome you all to tonight's the annual David S. Lobel Visiting Scholar Lecture tonight. And before I introduce tonight's speaker, I want to thank a couple people. First of all, David Lobel, who cannot be with us because he's in New York, who supports the program and endows the lecture. And my right hand in the office, Linda Huynh, who is the office manager and runs the program more than I do, and set up the program for tonight, and also Hillel, who's his co-sponsor for providing the space, and Rabbi Serena Eisenberg is here, and Rabbi Daniel Silverstein. So thank you everyone for helping make this possible. So it's a great pleasure to me to introduce my friend and colleague, Marc Michael Epstein, who currently holds the Mattie, Paschall, and Norman Davis Chair in Religion and Visual Culture at Vassar College, where he has been since, I believe, 1992. Marc has been also the first director of Jewish Studies at Vassar. He graduated from Oberlin and received his PhD from Yale University, although doing much of his research at Hebrew University in Jerusalem. I seem to recall that we met in Israel in a summer program, but for sure we spent many winter programs at the Association for Jewish Studies meetings in Boston, when they were held annually in Boston. During the 80s, Professor Epstein was director of the Hebrew Books and Manuscript division at Sotheby's, at the Judaica department, and continues to serve as consultant in various auctions and museums around the country and the world on manuscript issues. Over the subsequent years of his productive career, he has written many books on various topics in visual and material culture, and produced by and for and about Jews. And you want to not only have read each and every of his books, which are written so smartly, but you want to own them. And actually, Stanford Bookstore is selling the most recent one. You want to own them because they're so beautiful, and each of them are really a visual treat in their own right. In 2011, Yale University published his book on the Medieval Haggadah, very apropos in terms of season at the end of Pesach. The Medieval Haggadah, Art, Narrative, and Religious Imagination, which was selected by the London Times Literary Supplement as the best book of the year. That book provides a close analysis of the iconography of the Bird's Head Haggadah of 1300, the Golden Haggadah, the Rhineland's Haggadah, and the Brother Haggadah. Beautiful book. You want to own it, however, it's a little bit difficult to own it these days because it's right now no longer in print. We hope that it will be published. In it, for instance, he has, I can't help myself, want to emphasize, it has a chapter on the women in the Golden Haggadah, and a beautiful reading of all the representation of women in the Golden Haggadah. On the Bird's Haggadah, he writes, you get a little bit, even though you get a treat of this tonight anyhow, but the following: within the rather modest field of Jewish visual culture, the Bird's Haggadah is in its own unassuming way as mysterious as the pyramids of Giza, the monoliths of Easter Island, and the Mona Lisa's smile, and so on. He continues to work on the Haggadahs, and I think this year is coming out his edition of the Brother Haggadah. Of course, I like how Jews create a familial relationship between books. The Brother Haggadah is known as a Brother Haggadah because it sort of has a fraternal relationship with the Rhineland's Haggadah in Manchester. So there's a beautiful facsimile edition of that Haggadah coming out. But tonight he's speaking to us on the book that came out this year, which won the National Jewish Book Award last year, actually, in 2015, on medieval Jewish illuminated manuscripts, on Skies of Parchment, Seas of Ink. So please help me welcome Marc Epstein to the podium.
Thank you so much. Oh, wow. That was some introduction. I have to live up to it, right? I wanted to thank Professor von Robert for inviting me to speak this evening, to everyone at the Taube Center for their hospitality and accommodation, everyone at Hillel, thank you very much, and a special shout out, I imagine, as always, to Linda Huynh for her unflagging enthusiasm and cheerful efficiency. This is really a beautiful campus, all those palm trees, I mean, quite something. We don't have those in Poughkeepsie. And it's a pleasure and a privilege to be able to share some of my ideas with you tonight. A number of years ago, I was approached with a proposal for a monumental project. Would I be interested in writing a comprehensible history of and guide to the art of handmade illuminated books in Jewish history from, say, its very beginnings until, well, let's see, yesterday, right? Interested, I indubitably was. Qualified, less so. I mean, don't get me wrong, I do know a few things about books illuminated for Jews, but I don't know everything. And imagine how I felt when I learned that this was an enterprise that had been plotted and planned since the 1970s, and a project that had passed through the hands of no less than 6 editors, all of whom were scholars of considerable merit, talent, and enthusiasm. The writing was on the wall. I was destined to fail as they had, probably even more miserably. But I could save myself, at least, from falling into the error of the previous editors. The error of thinking that a single person could write such a book all by his or her lonesome. And so I knew what I had to do. Delegate. I assembled a crew of fine, interested and interesting scholars to aid me in this endeavor, and at least by the lights of the National Jewish Book Council, which did award the book Skies of Parchment, Seas of Ink, the National Jewish Book Award this year, we succeeded in producing a volume that is, I think, both beautiful and erudite. But honestly, because I regard the enterprise of scholarship as an act of translation, I'm most proud of the fact that this is a book that is, I sincerely hope, accessible to all, even and especially to those outside the groves of academe. Yet, the success of the book has brought with it its own dilemmas. Let's say I'm invited to the prestigious Stanford University to give a talk. Do I rest on the laurels of the book's beauty and simply show you gorgeous images from it, essentially reciting the content of the captions that I created for those images in the books? I certainly could do so. Believe me, it would not by any means be the first time a lecture on so-called Jewish art took that particular trajectory, right? So I could show you gorgeous images, how I love your Torah, and a manuscript of Maimonides, Italian synagogue of the Baroque period, the colophon, the signature of an artist in a 13th century manuscript, knights and dragons and odd creatures in a Pentateuch from about 1300, the Elijah the prophet entering the gates of Jerusalem from an Italian Haggadah, complete with the householder and his son on the ass of the ass, and the wife and daughter relegated to the tail. Very interesting. Or this ketubah, created for a Portuguese Jewish woman, and depicting Venus as love and Ceres as abundance, complete with bared breasts and people in wigs and Baroque clothing. Or these bizarre animal-headed righteous celebrating the Feast of the Righteous in the Ambrosian Bible, Achashverosh from the Book of Esther with the maidens in a Judeo-Persian manuscript. What is this? A women's yeshiva in a Haggadah from Darmstadt from the 14th century? A woman immersing herself in a mikveh around 1300 in Ashkenaz as her husband waits in the bed above holding a candle? The Falk family, right, at their magnificent Seder table in the 18th century. And then, actually, Charlotte, one thing in your wonderful introduction, you said this is a book about medieval manuscripts. It's actually not. It goes up till yesterday. So we have amazing contemporary images, such as the Second Commandment with its prohibition about creating any image of any living creature in the earth or the sea or the heavens, illustrated with illustrations of creatures in the earth, the sea, and the heaven from medieval Jewish manuscripts, right? This is a contemporary image. Contemporary Megillot, both Persian style and Indian, by an Indian Jewish artist, or these dudes, the Royal Teitelbaums, by a contemporary Williamsburg hipster artist who's fascinated with the Hasidim he sees around them. I could do that. I could give you a tour like that, but I'm not so lazy. Nor are you, I'm guessing, so complacent. On the other hand, I'm also guessing that a highly abstruse treatment of, parchment types and illumination methods and codicology and iconographic relationships would put you to sleep. I know it would put me to sleep. So I've settled on a topic that will allow us to look at some gorgeous, mysterious, intriguing images, while at the same time demonstrating something of the essence of the role that luxurious handmade books played in the lives of the Jews who commissioned them. The images in these books could express messages of protest and even dreams of subversion, messages and dreams that are very political indeed, and in fact can often feel as fresh as today's newspaper headlines. Although the book deals, as I've said, with Jewish illumination through the 21st century, the High Middle Ages, the 13th through the 15th centuries, is the headquarters, the fons et origo, of manuscripts illuminated for Jews. Jews were a demographic minority throughout this period in the West, occasionally envied, sometimes despised and persecuted, usually misunderstood. The pervasively Christian culture within which Jews lived constantly proclaimed the dominance of Christians and Christianity over Jews and Judaism. In a barrage of public contexts, Jews were daily faced with images such as that of the accursed and rejected synagogue, bless you, on the right. Here she is again in stone. Bless you. There you go. Or the Jewish tormentors of Jesus, these animal-like dark figures. Jesus is a nice Aryan boy, right? Or any of the other horrible images of terrible accusations that Christians leveled against Jews in the Middle Ages. Blood, ritual murder, and blood accusation. And Jews sometimes faced the terrible consequences of these hatreds and libels against them. Now, this was not to say that every day was a vale of tears for medieval Jews. Most days, Jews weren't being accused of blood libels or being burned. Most days, they learned and prayed and traded and played and lived their own very dynamic and creative lives. Most days, they enjoyed good relations with their Christian neighbors. Most days, they bought and sold eggs and milk, and some days, some of them, the very creme de la creme, the wealthiest elites, some of them commissioned manuscripts. And in spite of the dark days, they persevered in preserving their dignity and in perpetuating a positive national self-perception. There's a famous fable from Aesop that tells of a lion journeying with a man, and as they walked along, each one was boasting about himself. Along the side of the road, they found a stone carving that showed a man strangling a lion. "You see," said the man, "this proves that we're stronger than you lions and more powerful than any other animal." The lion replied, "Images like this are made by you. If lions could carve stones, you would see all the lions winning," and proceeded, without much more ado, to knock the man to the ground and devour him. Jewish tradition described Jews as the lions of Judah, promising them that they had been chosen by God from among the nations of the earth. It promised them that the end of the story would be a positive one for them, in spite of the terrible persecution they would have to endure. It would have been only natural for a people in such a position to think, as did the lion in Aesop's fables, images like this are all made by you. If we were the ones making the monuments, you would see us in a position of dominance. Works of art made for Jews, primarily magnificent hand-scribed and painted books, survive in small but sufficient numbers to confirm that the lions did in fact carve stones. What I'd like to explore with you this evening is what is, for me, the most significant as well as the most intriguing part of the fable, the lion's dream of what we would see if lions could carve stones. Do we in fact see all the lions, that is all the Jews, winning? What, in other words, are the anticipated and hoped for consequences of history as depicted in art made for Jews? Can somebody get this? Thanks.
No, please don't.
No, don't? Okay, thanks. Don't. Good. Okay. In 1986, while in a graduate seminar at Yale on medieval art, I wrote my first scholarly article. I want to revisit this image from that article as I've been rethinking it recently, exactly 30 years later. It comes from a manuscript made in Catalonia in the late 14th century, and it depicts a hare on a throne being served a drink by a dog. It seems at first blush, and indeed has been interpreted by all interpreters before myself, to be a typical example of a species of humorous art prevalent in the Middle Ages, the depiction of what in Latin is called the mundus inversus, the world turned upside down. But this image comes from a manuscript made for Jewish patrons, an illuminated Haggadah, a liturgical book containing the text used at the Seder, the home service, for the eve of Passover. In the article, I argued that since this is an example of cultural production created for the medieval Jewish minority, the timid hare in a situation of dominance should be read politically. The image in question appears as an upper marginal illustration. The bottom of the page depicts the Israelites slaving in Egypt, and the text rubrics reads, Avadim hayinu leFaro b'Mitzrayim, we were slaves to Pharaoh in Egypt. The implication here seems to be, we were slaves, but one day the Egyptian dogs will serve us. This reading is strongly corroborated by the correlation between the bent-over position of the laboring man ascending the ladder toward the taskmaster at the top of the tower, and the reversal of this iconography in the image of the laboring dog bowing down to hand a drink to the seated hare. This is but one example of very many from medieval manuscripts made for Jews in which a different perspective on history, a world seen from the end of time, allowed patrons to envision a future in which the pursued could triumph over their pursuers. 30 years later, in working on my new book, which will deal, among other things, with margins and marginality in Jewish visual culture throughout history, including the Middle Ages, I have returned to this illumination, although with new considerations. I find that I'm now interested in the way time works and the way in which action unfolds in these images. Revisiting the image, it strikes me that the viewer is confronted in the various parts of this single page with the past, the Egyptian slavery, and the present, the contemporary medieval dress, as well as the future, the hare and the dog, depicting the way things will be when Jews finally have sovereignty. The illumination thus simultaneously unfolds in three different, though interrelated, historical strata. We'll return to this image shortly. multiple time zones in a single manuscript or on a single page is a state of affairs that is common, in fact, the default in medieval art. Showing multiple scenes on the same page, often repeating the image of the central figure, like Moses in this Byzantine icon, is the way medieval art tends to work when depicting actions that occur in sequence. And art made for Jews proves no exception. Here's an illustration of, the triumph of Mordechai in a book called the Leipzig Machzor. And it's illustrated according to not the book of Esther, but the rabbinic elaborations, Midrash, on the book of Esther. And you know the story, perhaps, of the book of Esther, where Haman, the evil protagonist, is convinced that the king wishes to honor him. And so when the king asks, how should the man that the king wishes to honor be honored? He says, well, put him on the king's horse and dress him in the king's crown and put him in the king's robe. And someone should lead him through the city and shout, thus shall be done to the man that the king delights to honor. Right? And the king says, take those clothes and that horse and do this to Mordecai the Jew who sits at the king's gate. Now the rabbis, to increase the humiliation of Haman, told the following story. Haman's daughter, a very bad person, right, a woman, right, was waiting for her father to be led on the horse through the streets by Mordecai the Jew. And she was waiting with the chamber pot, the toilet, in her hand. And when she saw them passing under the window, she threw the chamber pot on the head of the person she thought was Mordecai. But alas, it was her father. And she was so humiliated and embarrassed by this realization that she jumped out the window and killed herself, committing suicide. According to standard medieval pictorial convention, here she appears twice, once at the window and the second time on the ground at the base of the tree on which Haman and his sons are hanged. Like the image of the hare served by the dog in the Barcelona Haggadah, this is a political image. It celebrates the reversal of fortunes for the Jews and the downfall of their enemies. But whereas the Barcelona Haggadah does this in a somewhat veiled and implicit way, after all, many scholars have mistaken the upper marginal illustration for a charming and humorous example of the world turned upside down, in the Leipzig Machzor's illustration of the humiliation of the daughter of Haman and her subsequent suicide, the very explicit double depiction invites the viewer to imagine a sequence of actions, something like this. In the Leipzig Machzor, both, you want to see it again? I'll show it again in case you missed it. 1 second. Here it goes. Wait. Okay. All right. There you go. Oh, can't quite get to it. 1 second. I think, here we go. Okay. No, okay, missed it. Okay, in the Leipzig Machzor, both the action of Haman's daughter and its ensuing consequence are depicted within the same frame. There are other images in medieval Jewish iconography that invite us to contemplate transformative action without depicting the ensuing consequence, only implying it. For instance, this giant dumb-looking bird, the Bar Yochni, described in the Talmud as being none too graceful. Once, it is said, it dropped a rotten egg out of its nest. The egg cracked, and its contents were so voluminous that they swamped 16 cities and uprooted 300 cedar trees. By illustrating the bird along with its egg in the image, the authorship of this manuscript is signaling its familiarity with the Talmudic account. Furthermore, by playing with the fact that the depiction appears in a particular logistical configuration within a circle, the authorship further hints at the disgusting culmination of the rabbinic tale of the Bar Yochni, transforming the image from a static one to one that implies an unfolding future action. The bird's feet appear to slip as it navigates the rounded inner surface of the frame. Like a hamster on a smooth wheel, it will soon fall backwards, crushing the giant egg or pushing it out of the frame. Viewing this image, one finds that the eye and the mind collaborate in a game of imagine what will happen next. The example of Haman's daughter represents the standard medieval convention for explicitly depicting the consequence of an action as it ensues from that action. The example of the Bar Yochni bird represents a witty anticipation of the rather disgusting consequences of the bird's actions, which are not illustrated, only implied. Now, both these examples depict actions and consequences that have occurred in the legendary past. Haman's daughter both poured the chamber pot on her father's head and jumped out the window, committing suicide way back in biblical times, or in the rabbinic mind, let's say. And the Bar Yochni bird pushed its egg out of its nest in the mythic once upon a time of the Talmudic tall tales. By way of contrast, the illustration in the Barcelona Haggadah represents yet another way of thinking about time, where, as we have noted, past, present, and future converge. The Egyptian slavery obviously occurs in the biblical past, but the fact that everyone is kitted out in contemporary medieval dress emphasizes that Jews in 14th century Barcelona saw themselves, in the words of the Haggadah, "Bechol dor vador chayav adam liros atzmo," everyone needs to see oneself, right, as if they themselves were slaves in Egypt, and by extension, understood their Christian overlords as analogous with the Egyptians. But there's another layer here, of course, the layer of the future yet to come. This is not explicitly depicted, but hinted at using animals in a manner that could just be humorous, but which really conceals, and not all that deeply at that, a more political message. Think of the subversiveness of Bugs Bunny, for instance, right? And remember that Disney, that arch goy, invented Mickey Mouse, but the very Jewish Warner Brothers came up with Bugs, right? Okay. But back to our medieval images. So what was just a conventional way of portraying unfolding action in the case of the Leipzig Machzor's treatment of narrative of Haman's daughter, and what was witty in the case of the Bar Yochni bird about to tip over its egg but not quite showing the tipping over in the Northern French miscellany, has become something else in the Barcelona Haggadah. It has become political, specifically because it combines and thus exceeds the temporal zones, the time zones it represents. The sum of its whole is greater than that of its parts. Time seems to make a habit of warping itself forward for Jews in the Middle Ages. Medieval art made for Jews is full of fantasies of a redeemed and redemptive future. These often appear in conjunction and contrast with depictions of suffering in the biblical past or in the unredeemed present. In the art they commissioned, Jews were able to project or imagine the future state of motion in an image in order to imagine a future state of history, a state in which their lot might be improved, in which their suffering might be ameliorated, and in which sometimes, like the lion of Aesop's fable, they might find themselves in a position of sovereignty and dominance. In the case of the Barcelona Haggadah, this projection is accomplished within the bounds of a single page. It's politically subversive, and in fact quite explicit if we resist discounting and disparaging the animal images as mere humorous decoration and take them seriously as political commentary. We can see the same progression from the benign and even humorous to the really political when actions and consequences unfold over a sequence of images in which the more recent image responds to an earlier image in some way. Let's look at another example in which a later image responds to an earlier one, but in which it does so in an apolitical, jocular, that is humorous manner. Here we see the Israelites leaving Egypt in the so-called Brother Haggadah, created circa 1330. At the top in the center, on one of the roofs or ramparts of a complex of buildings representing Egypt, a lone Egyptian trumpeter sounds the alarm, alerting the Egyptians that the Israelites are fleeing. See him? Okay. Here's an illustration of the same episode from the Rylands Haggadah, which is made under the influence of the Brother Haggadah not more than 10 years later. It contains all the same scenes as the Brother Haggadah, but it is configured in interestingly different ways. Note, for instance, the youthful and very heavily armed Israelites in this illustration. Look at all that armor, right? And contrast this with the more elderly and primarily unarmed Israelites in the earlier Brother Haggadah. Here there are only 4 armed figures, and neither of the 2 sword sheaths carried by 2 of the figures actually contain swords. The Brother Haggadah is very peaceful, very quietistic. The Rylands Haggadah is activistic and full of calls for vengeance against the Egyptians, who of course represent contemporary antagonists of medieval Catalonian Jews. I've shown in my Medieval Haggadah book how this demonstrates the differing political concerns on the part of the authorship of each manuscript. But this evening, for the purposes of discussing how time and action unfold in art made for Jews, I want to focus on the fact that in the depiction of the Exodus in the Rylands Haggadah, 4 figures appear on the ramparts of Egypt, pointing toward the departing Israelites. A 5th figure at the far right looks up in expectant alertness. When I first encountered these illuminations decades ago, it occurred to me that the Egyptians who watch and point from the ramparts of the city in the later book, the Rylands Haggadah, look for all the world as if they had been summoned by the trumpeter in the earlier Brother Haggadah. In particular, in the context of 2 manuscripts in which texts and images are read right to left, the rightward-facing figure in particular seems to clinch the reading, whether we place the trumpeter slightly above him or on a parallel. However, when I first had this thought, I dismissed it as too weird to even raise as a possibility when I was trying to get tenure. 30 years later, sitting on my well-upholstered chair, I'm thinking about this as what I call unfolding action. That is, action that takes place after the moment frozen in time in a given illumination. In this case, the unfolding action is extended over the space of 2 works of art separated by, let's say, 10 years. It's not explicit, but neither is it entirely hidden. Anyone can tell that there's some relationship between the 2 images. We know that the artists of the later manuscript knew the work of the artists of the earlier manuscript. And it is a fact that in this manuscript, in which narrative moves from right to left, the furthest right-hand figure is distinguished by his baldness and the fact that he turns backward, facing the direction of past action. Furthermore, we need to account for why 4 Egyptians suddenly appear on the ramparts, which in the slightly earlier Brother Haggadah were empty except for the trumpeter. What it looks like, if we place the manuscript side by side, as it were, is that the authorship of the earlier manuscript depicted a trumpeter sounding the alarm, and the authorship of the later manuscript, who knew the earlier manuscript, responds, depicting the consequences of the alarm, people appearing on the ramparts. This, of course, is not made explicit, nor could one prove it. It may be a sort of jocular homage, a way in which the authorship of the later manuscript acknowledges its debt to the authorship of the earlier manuscript. And it certainly doesn't seem to be political in any way. So remember, we've gone from a single page with different zones that is political to 2 monuments separated in time with a relationship that's cute but not political. So are there any examples of actions and their consequences unfolding over 2 works of art separated in time that are more explicitly political than the response of the Rylands Haggadah to the Brother Haggadah? Indeed, there are. Here's an image from the very first page of one of the earliest illustrated printed Haggadot, the Prague Haggadah of 1526. It interestingly depicts a hare hunt with a mounted hunter blowing his horn, pursuing with dogs a bunch of hares there are those hares again, into a net where they will, of course, be captured. Although it may seem strange that the depiction of a hunt, not a Jewish pastime, for hares, not kosher animals, might appear on the very first page of a Haggadah, it does so for a particular reason involving Jewish law and Judeo-German puns, but that's a discussion for another time. Given the fact that the hare became an unlikely, though ubiquitous symbol for the Jews, and that they are captured in this illustration, it's very interesting to note that the next illustrated Haggadah printed, the Augsburg Haggadah of 1534, depicted the hares as escaping the net. You see that? So these two illustrations, in the identical position in two different books, separated by 8 years, where the later one definitely had seen and known the earlier one, these two illustrations are intended to be read together. Just as I believe these two illustrations in the same position in the Rylands and Brother Haggadot. But whereas the effect is one of jocular homage within the framework of the mythical, historical scenario of the Exodus in this case, in the case of the Prague and Augsburg Haggadot, the effect is explicitly political and contemporary. The contrast between the negative outcome of the first iteration of this image in 1524, the hares, the Jews, are captured by the hunters, the non-Jews, and its quote-unquote correction in the next printed edition, 8 years later in 1534, the hares, the Jews, escape the non-Jews, shows us a desire on the part of the creators of the later version to represent a more upbeat conclusion. Their version, which shows the hares eluding the hunter, presents a hopeful message, a statement of defiance, very much in the spirit of the Haggadah's own statement of theology and theodicy and history. Shelo echad bilvad amar aleinu l'chaloseinu v'HaKadosh Baruch Hu matzilenu miyadam. More than one nation has, or one enemy, has stood up against us to destroy us. Indeed, in each and every generation they attempt to destroy us, but God has saved us from their hand. You see the relationship between the two images? Now, a hunt ain't over until it's over. And a hunt can end in one of two ways. It can be successful, or it can be unsuccessful. But the measure of its success is gauged by the perspective of its particular protagonists. Hunters and prey obviously hope for different outcomes. And what's a successful hunt for the hunters is an unsuccessful hunt for the prey, and vice versa. Read separately, one would notice nothing amiss about these images. They simply represent a successful and an unsuccessful hunt from the perspective of the hunter. But read together and from the perspective of the quarry, of the prey, they represent something very different indeed. They represent another way of thinking about time and unfolding action in art made for Jews. They're only semi-explicit in that one needs to know that they should be read together, and they extend the statement they're making over two consecutive printings of the Haggadah, two separate books, where the creators of the later example knew the early work and did not like its message, yet read together, they form a very strong and explicit statement of protest and represent a dream of subversion and escape from contemporary repressive circumstances. These aren't Egyptians and Israelites. These are hares and hunters and contemporary hunters, right? This is not a reference to some national memory of Egyptian slavery, nor is it some hope for messianic redemption, right? It is rather an explicit articulation of a statement that would have been risky for Jews to make during the period of its creation. You, the Gentiles, are the hunters. We, the Jews, are your quarry, but God is on your side. You are not clever enough to prevent us from escaping you. Thus, the covert language of art steps into the breach and allows this message of protest, this dream of subversion, but only if one knows to read these two images together. By itself, the 1526 image is implicit. It is innocent, so to speak. Only by reading it together with the 1534 image that responds to it do we get the whole subversive picture. Only then do we as readers commit, as viewers I should say, commit the thought crime of denigrating the best efforts of our enemies as bumbling and ineffective and inevitably destined to fail. So we've seen action unfolding in sequences of images made over time that pays homage to or corrects prior images by responding to them. 1330, 1340, 1526, 1534. This action can be apolitical, as in the jocular homage from the authorship of a later manuscript to its inspiration in an earlier manuscript. Or it can be political, where the authorship of a later work of art disagreed with the worldview of the authorship of an earlier work and sought to amend it. And we've seen images that unfold explicitly on a single page, showing us the past suffering of the Jews and their future vindication. Besides being explicit, these types of images are also very political. We've also seen images that are neither political nor even explicit, but which only hint at the result of an action, leaving the rest to our imaginations. But what about images that unfold in the course of a single space, in which the message is implicit, that is, it only hints at the result of an action, leaving the rest to our imaginations, but unlike the image of the Bar Yochni bird, the message is political? Wouldn't such images be best and most interesting places in which to conceal subversive dreams, to speak secretly of ideas of which explicit articulations might have been risky for Jews? I'll conclude my talk this evening by showing you some examples of actions and their consequences unfolding in a sequence of images in a single space, where the strong political and theological lesson is implicit and thus concealed from prying eyes and wagging tongues. Armed with the methodology of reading these images that we've already employed, we will take it as our task to tease out these hidden and subversive messages. First, an example of how images can present a theological outlook or point of view. This seems at first glance to be a merely decorative image. It's a depiction from the so-called Leipzig Machzer, the book with the image of Haman's daughter committing suicide, which you'll remember was very early 14th century, of 4 stylized flowers surrounding the word Shoshan, which means rose or lily. It's the initial word for the liturgical poem Shoshan Emek Ayuma, the trembling rose or lily of the valley, recited at the additional service of Musaf on the morning of Yom Kippur, the Day of Atonement. These stylized flowers, so flat and symmetrical, with a single uniformly sized point in the middle, bring to mind volvels. Volvels are free rotating wheels of parchment or paper laid into manuscripts or early printed books to save the reader the trouble of turning the entire volume in order to view a part of a chart. And that's what they evoked for me. And I tried to figure out why. And on closer scrutiny, I realized why it was these flat images conveyed that impression. Although the 2 flower circles above the initial word, here it says le musaf or musaf, are bounded with these very handsome diamond-shaped decorations. You see them? Here they're in white against the blue, and here they're incised into the gold, diamonds. The 2 flower circles below the initial word have distinctly directional arrows. Do you see that? In white and blue again, and here incised in the gold, making it seem as though they should revolve. Moreover, there's this further imagery. A dog stands rather precariously on the right-hand circle, while a hare, looking off and to the left, balances equally unstably on the left-hand circle. And in the center, with its tail hanging down, in the most narrow space between them, a dragon opens his mouth and roars, his head and body positioned upward as if to ascend to that word, Shoshan. What is depicted here is most definitely a moment frozen in time. As in the case of the Bar Yochni bird about to tip over and crush its egg, the illuminators are humorously toying with the shapes on the page to create a precarious balance that will be upset in a moment. Yet the stakes are greater in this case. We've had ample evidence that for 14th century Jews, the image of a hare pursued by dogs represented the pursuit of Israel by her non-Jewish persecutors. Likewise, for that same population, the dragon, this is all in my very first book, represents a quasi-divine force of great evil that is perpetually attempting to harm the Jewish people, here represented by the word Shoshan, the rose of the lily of the valley, that's in the Song of Songs, that's the Jewish people, and even to usurp the place of God. Although the hare would like to get off its treadmill, it seems that for all intents and purposes, it's locked into the seemingly endless cycle of its pursuit by the dog, and the dog too seems inevitably doomed to continuously carry out this ultimately futile hunt. One can imagine the Jews for whom this image was created sighing under what they perceived as the boundless and immeasurable burdens of exile, and what they felt was the interminable saga of their pursuit by the nations of the world. But the illumination injects a couple of hopeful notes. First of all, the dog will never actually capture the hare. In other words, while suffering is inevitable, to quote Jeremiah, "Yet even in those days, declares the Lord, I will not destroy you completely. I am with you, and I will save you." For there is a deeper, more theological observation being made by this imagery. As a result, you ask, does the pursuit of Israel by the nations have any goal? What does it do? What good is it? Well, as a result of the very same frustrating, apparently futile process of history, which consists here of the endless cycle of the pursuit of Israel, when, in other words, those wheels begin and continue to move, the forces of evil in the universe, as represented by the dragon, will be brought down and crushed. You can imagine it. The wheels moving, the tail catching, the dragon being pulled under and never having the opportunity to rise up and seize and harry the inviolable Shoshan, Israel. The message, in a nutshell, Israel will suffer. The suffering will seem endless, but as a result of the very process of history set into motion by that suffering, redemption will come and evil will quite literally be crushed. In a context where art speaks to political and theological concerns, implied ensuing action indicating a present, and helping the viewer project or imagine a future state for any given object, can transform what at first seems to be a frozen scene into an articulation of potentiality or consequence. When we take into account the unfolding action that is implied in an image, we expand our horizons regarding the potential meanings of that image. The view of the object at rest is a snapshot, as it were, of the present state of theological and political affairs in a given moment. But as soon as we notice that some unfolding action is implied, it becomes clear that the current state of political and theological meaning may also hint at or imply a potentiality or consequence that's only implicit when one merely looks at the image at rest. When we consider when we consider the image as a snapshot of a moment in a continuum, the ultimate political and theological messages implied but not articulated in the image reveal themselves. The strategy of implying but not explicitly showing unfolding action has the advantage of allowing the image to remain innocent in the eyes of a similarly innocent viewer. At the same time, For those whose eyes have been opened to the strategy, the image's static present is simply a doorway to imagining its potential future once it gets moving, so to speak. And once it does get moving, it does so in this matter. Dogs, they always do that stuff. Finally, I'd like to conclude with an image that seems to me to beautifully exemplify the employment of implied ensuing action to present subversive dreams. It's an illumination in a Hebrew Bible made by Joseph the Frenchman, that's how he calls himself, in Severa, Spain, 1299 to 1300, and now housed in the Biblioteca Nacional de Portugal in Lisbon. I got all the lisps right, I hope. The images I wish to discuss are spread across a 2-page opening and serve as upper marginal illustrations to a grammatical text, Sefer HaNikud by David Kimchi. These illuminations are apparently unrelated to this relentlessly dry grammatical text. In a recent article celebrating the loan of this manuscript for display at the Metropolitan Museum in New York, author Robin Chambliss describes the image in question as a quote-unquote courtly hunting scene. A falconer and a crossbow-aiming figure converge on a bird perched in a crenellated tower. She asks, do such motifs hold larger symbolism for Sephardic Jews? And cites Barbara Böhm, curator of medieval art in the cloisters at the Metropolitan Museum, as asserting that sometimes a crossbow is just a crossbow. I am, in fact, in agreement with Barbara Böhm. Indeed, sometimes a crossbow is just a crossbow, just not in this case. Let's look at what's depicted here more closely. Again, as in most Hebrew manuscripts, the action moves from right to left. On the right-hand page, we witness a commotion. An armed man is drawing a sword and running toward what we can only presume to be the scene of some great battle or the hunt of... Oh, bless you, thank you. Thank you. He's running toward some great battle or to execute the coup de grace on some dangerous beast requiring dispatch with the sword. He's urged on by another man, right, this way to the beach, right, who points him in the direction of the left-hand side of the page, of the 2-page spread. And there on the other side of the page, expecting to see some sign of great carnage or a dangerous beast cornered and needing to be subdued and dispatched by the sword, we're surprised to see only 2 hunters attacking a little black bird, which seems to have come momentarily to rest on a parapet, having thus just folded its wings. The tiny creature is being shot at from the left with an almost grotesquely large crossbow. This is a direct attack with an overly powerful weapon for such a little bird. I mean, you know crossbow. Any of you in the Society for Creative Anachronism, you get dressed up on Sundays in armor? No, I thought not. Okay. If you know that, right, they must have that. They must have that at Stanford. Probably the physics students do that. Okay. Right. So crossbow bolts, as surely you Society for Creative Anachronism people know, are designed to pierce heavy armor, not to shoot ravens. And this is a gesunte, a healthy example, right? So one imagines that the bolts are quite heavy. At right, a falconer prepares to fly his hawk. Now this is an attack on the bird via an intermediary, a method that's both less direct than a crossbow, right? And generally the province of more socially elite hunters. This too is disproportionate and unrealistic attack. One flies hawks to hunt, I don't know, hares, or small mammals, or even edible smaller birds. But a raven? Excuse me. A raven is a troublemaking scavenger, a garbage bird, a gallows bird beloved by nobody, except maybe the warders of the Tower of London who keep ravens, right? Nobody eats ravens. One wants to rid oneself of them, not pursue them. And as anyone who's trained or hunted with raptors knows, sending a hawk to capture a raven is a ludicrous waste of time and effort. The whole thing seems to be a bit of comedy on the theme of outrageously overdetermined violence. So much firepower against so small a menace. So what's the upshot of all this hubbub? Well, the little black bird, as we've noticed, has just come momentarily to rest. But one of its feet is already off the parapet, and it tilts its head, inclining a beady eye in the direction of the crossbow wielder, while simultaneously turning toward the hawker. The angle of its head and the position of the black iris of its eye within the white give it a slightly incredulous and mocking and ironic and skeptical look. In a second, it will be off, eluding the deadly but too heavy crossbow bolt. The hawk, expecting to be launched at a hare, will momentarily be confused, and therefore, though swift, will not be swift enough to catch the little raven. The urgent summons of this gentleman will seem, well, foolish and superfluous, as our sword-bearing protagonist, yet breathing out threatenings and slaughter, arrives on the scene, sword drawn, earth-bound, only to watch the little black bird sail away on the breeze, cawing in triumph at its escape. In such a circumstance, then, I'm afraid I cannot agree that a crossbow is just a crossbow. What I read here politically is as follows. In the medieval liturgical poetry of Jewish Spain, the people of Israel were often configured as the achot kitana v'shecharachoret, the niña morena, the little black girl, downcast and darkened by her sins, awaiting redemption. In this image, Israel, the abject raven, is hunted by various means. On the one hand, by heavy-handed and overblown assaults which come from a weapon in the shape of a cross, perhaps representing the church. On the other, there's another method, one more conventional in the hunting of birds and a more noble pursuit, hawking, generally a courtly prerogative and pleasure. Hawking, you remember, is hunting by means of an intermediary. Thus, if the crossbow bearer represents the church and the hunter represents the secular nobility oppressing the Jews, their hawks themselves might signify their agents, perhaps the malshinim, the Jewish informers, that is, other captive birds doing the will of the nobility. And then there's the army or the mob. In any event, militarized onlookers ready to sweep down even more heavy-handedly at a moment's notice from informers to administer the coup de grace, a fatal blow which is unnecessary and would be almost comedically exaggerated were it not so cruel. This unfair and overdetermined nature of the hunt, in fact, elicits mercy from God toward God's people, in spite of the fact that they are colored as black as a raven with sin. And although they may have deserved punishment, the hunt, in fact, ends with the Jews eluding their pursuers, something like this. Thank you. Okay, I see we already have a question. Am I going to field my own questions? I will do that on the condition that the people asking their questions identify themselves by their first name and ask questions rather than... Yes, yes.
Could you also repeat the questions?
Certainly. I'd be happy to repeat the questions, assuming I understand them. You, sir. Hi.
Hi.
Who are you?
My name is Bob. My question is, when you showed the example of the hunter and the hares from 1526 and 34,
Right.
what is going on in the surrounding historical context? I know it's obviously after the exile from Spain, but what else is going
Good.
on?
Good. So what's going on generationally, historically, between the Prague Haggadah of 1524 and the Augsburg Haggadah of eight years later? My answer to that question is lots was going on historically. The problem we have is that historians tend to look at art historians like me. I'm not really an artist. I'm a historian of, I don't know what the hell I am, okay? But tend to look at people like me and say, we need to find a historical event that corresponds to what's going on in the art. Now, what you have to realize is that, say, the Rylands Haggadah, the one with all the arms and the armor, the one that says, if you read my book, that says, screw you, Egyptians. You know, we saw the brother Haggadah, and there were, in the plagues, there's just a few frogs in the plague of frogs. That's not enough. Give us more frogs. We want more blood, right? Give those Egyptians what they deserve, right? The fact is that that book, the Rylands Haggadah, was made at a time in Spain when everything was pretty hunky-dory. When Jews had the $600,000 or so it took to commission such a manuscript, when Jews lived relatively quietly. So the question is not what was happening historically, although if we found events, maybe we could correlate it. The question is this. For Jews, there were always two parallel strands. Whatever was going on with Jews, whatever was actually going on with them, their liturgy and their rhetoric said, essentially, everybody's persecuting us, God will save us, right? Constantly. You sit in America and, you know, things are pretty good. I know people think now that, you know, Vassar College is the most anti-Semitic college in the universe. You can find that on the internet. But, you know, the fact is that I sat at my Seder table and, you know, and nobody threw a rock through the window. And, you know, we did very well and we're doing very well. And yet, what is it? What do we tell our kids? Oh, the world is full of anti-Semitism. Everything's, you know, and if you're religious, of course, it's, you know, religiously oriented. It's even, the rhetoric is even greater. And when you say every generation they persecute us and God saves us from their hand, it doesn't much matter what's actually going on. At a Seder in Auschwitz, right? They said, in every generation they persecute us and God saves us from their hand. And in a Seder in Brooklyn in 2016, the hipsters are saying the same thing. Right? It's an incomparable situation. So I would say that whatever was going on between 1524 and 1530, whatever it is, right? 36, what happened was this. Image A has the first half. Oh, they persecute us, isn't it terrible? They're always, right? People looked at that and said, you know, I'm going to print another Haggadah. We're going to do another Haggadah this year in Augsburg. And let me tell you, we're going to fix what the Prague did, because it's such a negative outlook. Doesn't it say, and God saves us from their hand? Let's do the God saves us from their hand bit, right? So that's what's going on. In other words, monuments, by which I mean works of art, are talking to each other, and they're talking to and about the liturgy. Sometimes there are actual events that might have influence, but we can't pinpoint those with any certainty. But thank you, that's a very good historical outlook. Smart questions, just smart. Oh, this is Stanford, that's right. So, okay, let's see, show me what you got. Anybody? Yes, who are you?
My name's Quan.
Hi, Quan.
Dumb question.
There are no dumb questions, only dumb people, and you're not one. You're at Stanford. Remember that.
So two wheels spinning.
Right.
I really like that analogy, but why aren't they spinning towards each other?
Okay, right. I think they're intended to crush a dragon. My students, my sort of physics-oriented students always ask, they say, well, if they really started moving, it wouldn't work that way. You know, so I had them do an experiment. I had them get 2 exercise balls, because what the hell do we know about the way animal feet work, right? You know, so get 2 exercise balls, a puppy and a bunny, and we, you know, they both. The puppy tends to pull forward more with its front legs, although it uses its hind legs, and the bunny tends to use its hind legs. The result of all this experimentation was that we don't really think. None of my students and I don't. This is what undergraduates do. You know, graduate students. If I had graduate students, they would be very serious. We wouldn't be doing any of this stuff. But undergraduates, right? So the result of all this experimentation was that it's the general idea right? It wasn't logistically specific. So maybe the interest is in crushing the dragon. I mean, these two questions work together. Do you see, right? You guys, you want to know about history, right? And you want to know about physics, right? And these people were patrons and artists, and they liked the general idea of things moving that way. And I don't think necessarily that they calculated it to that precise a degree. But you might when you create your own illuminated manuscript. Thanks. Yes, you are? You look so familiar to me. Oh, okay.
I get that a lot.
Yeah. My first wedding, the rabbi referred to me as Eric, which is not my name. That boded ill for that marriage. Go ahead.
So you mentioned that.
Who are you, first of all? Your name?
I'm Zoe.
Hi, Zoe.
You mentioned that the reason why the image of the hunt was in this particular book was a story for another day.
Yes.
Even though it is not another day, could you tell the story?
I don't know. Does my will I get a double honorarium as a result? Will that happen? Okay. So we have a problem this year and any other year when the Seder occurs on a Saturday night, because we have to say bye-bye to Shabbos. Shabbos is going away. We have to say bye-bye to Shabbos, okay? And we have to say hello to Pesach, right? So what order do we say? Where does Havdalah, the separation prayer, fit in? So the way you remember that, says the Talmud, is by use of an acronym. Yakin Nehaz. Yayin, the prayer over wine. Borei Priagafen, right? Kiddush, the sanctification prayer of the holiday. Asher b'achar banu mikol olam, v'roi mimanu mikol lashon, v'kiddishanu b'mitzvah yisov. Right? Yayin, Kiddush. Ner, the blessing over the candle. Havdalah, the separation prayer. And Zman, she'echianu v'kiyamanu v'kiyanu azman hazeh. Thank God for bringing us to this season. Now, in Talmudic Aramaic, that acronym, Yakin Nehaz, meant nothing. Nothing. You just had to remember Yakin Nehaz. But in lands where Judeo-German Proto-Yiddish was spoken, the word, the nonsense acronym Yakin Nehaz sounded to people like the words Yag Den Haz, which means hunt the hare. And so you put a hare hunt on the first page of the Haggadah right under Havdalah, so you would remember, that's great, right? You're going to do that when you make your Haggadah, right? To remind you of how to do the thing. That's it. All right, now I can't come back, I guess. All right. We have time for only 7 more questions. Yes?
My name is Tony Sanchez.
Hi, Tony. Thanks.
Although I'm really moved by the stories of the hare and the crossbow,
right,
and the oppression, and so much of the suffering of the Jews, the history goes back to to escaping Israel of Egypt and so forth, and to the present in the news of a lot of countries in the Middle East and stories you hear, not to mention countries like Iran that want to annihilate Israel and so forth. I'm just surprised that there's not any artwork on anything about of things being better, or like a Messiah or something like that, or a solution to,
right,
or some.
You mean contemporary artwork, right? Well, there probably, in fact, there is, but I wasn't showing it, right? My current project is working on contemporary Haredi, that is ultra-Orthodox kitsch art, and in those images, they're sort of contemporary updatings of these kinds of images. So perhaps one day I'll be able to present on that. But yes, Jews always made art. They continue to make art, and the art is always politically relevant, right? Anybody else? Yes, you are?
I'm Jeremiah.
Thank you, Jeremiah. We've met in Allentown, Pennsylvania for our sins, yes.
Can you talk a little bit about the role of artistic agency?
Yeah, good. Okay, so artistic agency, in other words, that's a fancy academic way of saying, who made these things? If they were they made by Jews? Were they made not by Jews? If the non-Jews made them, how could they hide and encode all these messages, right? It seems that, for the most part, everything I showed you tonight, for the most part, was made by non-Jews working for Jews. And this was not possible before 1300. Before 1300, you wanted a manuscript, you had to go to a monastery. Jews didn't go to monasteries, right? But after 1300, manuscript workshops moved to the high-end cathedral streets of almost every town in Europe, and anybody, Jewish or Christian, with wherewithal, meaning money, could walk into these places, plunk a bag of gold on the table and say, give me a book, right? So a Jew walks in, this sounds like a joke, a Jew walks into a manuscript workshop and says, give me a book. What kind of book do you want? Oh, I'd like a Haggadah. What? No. Well, it's a prayer book. Prayer book, I get that. It's a Christian artisan, right? What is going to be in this prayer book? Well, there's this text about this Hebrew. Oh, no, we don't do Hebrew text. No, you won't have to do the Hebrew text. I have a scribe who's going to do the Hebrew text. But I want to have a series of illustrations leading up to the text with depictions of scenes from the Torah. The what? The Old Testament. Oh, yes. We have something. It's called the Book of Hours. Let me show it to you. Oh, this is great. I love this. Well, can I have this image, but take out the halos? And how about this image, but instead of his arms being like that, put them down like this? And, right? So this is how it was. You know, you think that life in the Middle Ages was a vale of tears where Jews were getting their tuchas kicked all the time, and that's all that happened. There were these interactions. So when a Jew says to a Christian, right, and here I want a hare hunt, the Christian artist is thinking, oh, a hare hunt. We hunt hares all the time. The Christian artist isn't thinking, oh, a hare hunt. Perhaps the Jew wants to represent herself as the hare and us as the dog. And now there's going to be an outcome where the hare triumphs over the dog. Oh my God, I'm illustrating a subversive manuscript. No, it's a hare hunt, right? Or you say, now put the dog on the throne, the hare on the throne, and have the dog bowing to him. They say, oh, that's funny. It's like we do this all the time in manuscripts for monks. You know, right? So there's a collaboration that requires the Christian artist to be somewhat in the dark, but what's important, and not really in the dark, just doing his or her thing, but what's important, what's determinative is the patron. It's the patron with the money bag who goes in there and says, this is what I want. And that patron works very closely with rabbinic advisors, right? And determines what should appear on the page and where and how. And you think, oh, why they work with rabbinic advisors? They were involved in what goes on the page. Look, this is very expensive. If you build a house, right, and you commission Frank Gehry, and I hope you do, to build your house, you don't say, Frank, put in as many bathrooms as you like. Right? Don't ask me how many kids I have. You're a genius. You can figure. Give me as many kids' rooms. Right? Put whatever you want in the kitchen. You want to put a Kenmore stove? That's fine. I was thinking of a Viking, but I trust you. No, you're very specific about what you want. The more money you have, the more makpi, the more attention you put into what you want. And so it was a very expensive enterprise. These things cost, when I said $600,000, I'm not exaggerating. $600,000 in the bloody Middle Ages? That's insane. Right? This was, first of all, we're talking about very elite art, and we're talking about people who were very involved. So patron-driven, patron-determined. That's the short answer. Anybody else? Yes, you are?
Margaret.
Hi, Margaret.
What's the source from which that lets you know about the collaboration and the interaction and what it costs? Where do you learn these things?
We know a lot about the way manuscripts were made for Christians, and since there weren't separate Jewish workshops, we assume that what went on in manuscript workshops making manuscripts for Christians was what was going on for Jews. And we see that the images look very similar between, two manuscripts, one made for Christians and one made for Jews at the same time.
What's that source?
What's the source? So there are records, there are very few Jewish manuscripts left because many of them were burnt and destroyed, but there are tons of Christian manuscripts, and we can trace motifs and how they develop. In other words, what historians, with all respect to the historians, want, they always want a document, right? But what cultural historians realize is that these books are documents themselves. If we have enough of them, we make assumptions based on what we see in them about the relationships between them. So sometimes there's external documentary evidence, but sometimes we just collect all these images and we can talk about them. Yes? Yeah?
Vered.
Hi, Vered.
So do you see connections between non-Jewish text and Jewish text in terms of the illustrations? Do they sometimes choose from non-Jewish?
Absolutely, absolutely.
The second question is, are we sure that the stories that we're telling are, that there are these two images and there isn't a third image, or that they both are...
Good. So the answer to the first question is yes, and the answer to the second question is no. And let me elaborate, okay? It's very clear when I see an image of Moses and his family fleeing from Midian to Egypt, and it looks like the flight into Egypt in medieval Christian art, that one is being taken from the other. I used to think that Jews took everything from Christians. Now I think that there were model books out there, and there's sort of a mutual pool of imagery, and Jews and Christians are both fishing. Sometimes they pull out the same image and they spin it differently. They interpret it differently. So there's clearly relationships. It used to be the old Israeli school that wanted to admit, quote unquote, Jewish art into the larger field of world art, was always trying to show how Jewish art was dependent on Christian art. I don't think that's the case. I think there's a dynamic relationship going on. That's my diaspora view. And secondly, we don't know. We don't know that any of these things are configured the way I projected them. However, I'm presenting you with a constellation of plausible possibilities. There's evidence that I don't have, much is missing, and there's evidence that might be relevant that I don't know about, right? But what I'm doing is, given the material I have, I'm trying to interpret it in a plausible way. So what I often say to people, I'm not implying, Vera, that you don't like my interpretations, maybe you do. But if you don't like my interpretations, that's fine. But you are under the onus to do two things then. One, explain very articulately as I have explained what my contentions are, why and what you don't like about it. You can't just say, well, that's speculative. That's not, you have to explain why. And two, propose an alternate interpretation of your own based on the same materials, right? Okay. It's been a great pleasure to be here, and really it was worth coming from Poughkeepsie. It's always worth coming from Poughkeepsie. 2 Vassar graduates in the audience, but it was really a pleasure. So thank you.